He was a genius, mysterious, and haunted by guilt. The man who gifted the world its most dangerous weapon. This is the story of the father of the atomic bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer. You never met him, but he changed you. He changed all of us. He created something so powerful, the world could never be the same again. But why did he say those haunting words? Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Was it pride? Was it fear? Or was it the weight of a man who finally understood what he had done? Let's walk through the darkness and take a look inside the soul of the man who split the atom and history itself. Fact 1. The first trace of genius. He wasn't an ordinary child. Oppenheimer was reading Shakespeare at the age of 5 and writing his own stories by 6. But that was only the beginning. By 12, he was already fascinated by quantum physics. His teachers used to say, "This boy isn't just smart, he thinks differently." Young Robert was, quite literally, ahead of his time. He understood things others hadn't even begun to imagine. It was as if he already knew what the future held. Intelligence wasn't a gift he received. It was the burden he carried. Fact 2. Two geniuses, one silence. When two geniuses stand in the same room, whose voice prevails? Silence or truth? At Princeton University, two of the greatest minds walked the same campus. One was already a legend, Albert Einstein. The other was still trying to understand his own destiny, J. Robert Oppenheimer. They were close, but they were never friends. Einstein never fully trusted Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer never felt at ease around Einstein. There was a quiet tension between them. No arguments, no shouting, just looks filled with questions. Because while Oppenheimer was shaping the future, Einstein was afraid of what that future would become. One day, Einstein turned his back on Oppenheimer and never looked at him again. Why? What happened that day? What words were exchanged that changed everything? No one knows for sure. But one thing is clear, these two minds, though they lived in the same world, were staring into different universes. Fact 3. A secret love and political danger. There was a woman in his life, one who shook him not with her mind, but with her heart. Jean Tatlock, beautiful, melancholic, and lost in her own search for meaning. She wasn't a journalist. She wasn't a scientist. But to Oppenheimer, she was a puzzle more complex than any equation. Every moment with her felt like stepping into a secret. Their conversations were deep, their glances long, their goodbyes exhausting. Jean was known for her communist sympathies. The government saw her as a threat. But Oppenheimer, he loved her. Quietly, fearfully, perhaps recklessly, risking his own future without even realizing it. That love, years later, would come back to haunt him. It became his first vulnerability, the first weapon used against him. Because there was one force just as powerful as the atomic bomb, the silence of a woman, and the gaze of a man who could never forget her. Fact 4. The Manhattan Project, behind silent mountains. Sometimes history is written in silence, not with swords or flags, but with equations, closed doors, and secret glances. In 1942, the US government made a decision. The atomic bomb would be built, but who could be trusted with such a burden? The answer was simple, though not easy: Robert Oppenheimer. Thousands of scientists, engineers, and soldiers all looked to one man. Los Alamos, a quiet, sealed-off city in the mountains, was more than just a laboratory. It was the center of destiny. Oppenheimer spent every night buried in formulas, every morning burdened by silence. This was no longer just physics. This was the future of mankind. He wasn't just a director. He was like a prophet. Everyone waited for a sign from him. But he lived with only one question in his mind. If we succeed, where will the world go next? Fact 5. The first nuclear explosion. The Trinity moment, July 16, 1945. In the darkness of the New Mexico desert, there was no city, no light, only a few hundred people, and one shared, secret purpose. Silence hung heavy, ready to shatter at any moment. Everyone knew this would be a turning point in human history. Oppenheimer stood still, staring into the distance. His eyes reflected the blinding light, and in that moment, he remembered an ancient verse from Hindu scripture. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. That explosion was the beginning of a new era and the birth of an unfathomable tragedy. Fact 6. The pain and regret over the bombs on Japan. Robert Oppenheimer reached the pinnacle of science, creating the most powerful weapon the world had ever seen. But that peak was a lonely, cold place. In August 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were obliterated by atomic bombs. Thousands of innocent people, women, children, the elderly, vanished in an instant. Oppenheimer watched the horror unfold before his eyes, on television, in newspapers. This was no longer science, it was the symbol of tragedy. The great scientist of the secret Los Alamos lab had become a victim of the very weapon he had created. When he met President Truman, he said quietly, "Mr. President, I feel the blood on my hands." Truman responded with anger, but Oppenheimer knew he was caught between science and politics. He was no longer just a scientist. He bore the heavy burden of creating the most terrifying power on Earth. That regret never left him for the rest of his life. A living example of how dangerous science can be for humanity. Fact 7. Accused of espionage and political pressure. The man who once guarded his country's greatest secret became the center of suspicion and accusations. During the peak of the Cold War, America even doubted its own heroes. Oppenheimer's past connections, especially his ties to the Communist Party, made him a target. He was accused of espionage, not as a bearer of science, but as a traitor to the state. His security clearance was revoked, and the darkest chapter of his life began. He carried a heavier burden than the power he had created: persecution and isolation. Once one of the world's most respected scientists, he became the subject of doubt and condemnation. The political pressure left a deep scar on Oppenheimer's life, turning his story into not just one of science, but of injustice and human drama. Fact 8. Opposition to the hydrogen bomb, between conscience and fear. For Oppenheimer, the atomic bomb was already in the past. A new, darker horizon was rising: the hydrogen bomb. It was a weapon far more powerful, far more destructive than anything before. Never in human history had such a terrifying force existed. He opposed the development of this bomb. Deep in his heart, there was fear, a fear that science was leading humanity toward an even greater disaster. His friends and political leaders thought differently. They believed this new weapon would give them the upper hand in the Cold War. Inside Oppenheimer, a fierce struggle raged between his responsibility as a scientist and his conscience as a human being. He saw clearly that if they proceeded down this path, the end of the world was a little closer. His voice was drowned out by political noise and pressure, but he never backed down. Saying this was not easy. "I will not go down this path. It is dangerous for humanity." These words became his solitude. This stance made him a target of attacks and marked the beginning of his political downfall. But he made his choice. He raised his conscience above all, showing that scientific power is powerless before human responsibility. Fact 9. A lonely life and philosophical reflections. The inner world of a genius. His final years were dark and lonely. The political storms that followed his great scientific achievements pushed him to the edges of society. He was alone now. But loneliness was not just physical isolation. Deep within his soul, a great battle raged. At night, he would gaze at the stars, finding his smallness in the vast silence of the universe and feeling how fragile humanity truly was. He had dreamed of empowering humanity through scientific progress, but now he felt the weight of the destruction his creation could bring. His thoughts were never far. Why do we exist? When given power, how should we wield it? Genius is also a great burden. He was no longer just a physicist. He had become a philosophical traveler, searching for the deep meanings of life, death, power, and justice. But that search was not easy. He was both a victim of the power he created and a warning to humanity. The world grew colder and more incomprehensible to him. People forgot him or refused to face the truth. Yet Oppenheimer thought, wrote, and lived in silence, embodying the complex interplay of science and the human spirit. This lonely man's story left a deep mark, not only in the history of science, but in the conscience of humanity. Fact 10. Delayed justice, the silence of the soul and final recognition. Robert Oppenheimer's life was filled with both the peaks of genius and the painful valleys of despair. During the political storms of the 1940s and 50s, he was hailed as a hero, but soon faced suspicion, accusations, and pressure. In 1954, at the height of the Cold War, his security clearance was revoked. The great scientist was cast aside by his own country. He was once a man working for the future of science and humanity, now an innocent victim of persecution. This was more than a career loss. It was a deep wound to his soul. But time changed. As years passed, Oppenheimer's contributions and his principled, conscientious stance became clearer. In 1963, the U.S. Department of Energy awarded him the Enrico Fermi Medal, a delayed yet heartfelt recognition. He had already passed away, but this honor was a just acknowledgement of his life and deeds. Though delayed, justice sometimes brings silence to the heart. Oppenheimer's story is one of the power of science and the complexity of the human spirit, an eternal lesson for generations to come. And Oppenheimer, he never stayed silent. Perhaps he spoke too late, perhaps too heavily, but history heard him. He became death, the destroyer of worlds. But in the end, he chose to remain human. If this story made you think, share your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next great story. Because history remembers not the silent, but the speaking.